Welcome to Grace Fellowship Baptist Church Wednesday evening Bible study for Wednesday, April 1st, 2026. We are in the book of 2nd Chronicles. We're in chapter 35. We're at verse 20. After all this, when Josiah had set the temple in order, Necho, king of Egypt, went out to fight at Carchemish on the Euphrates, and Josiah marched out to meet him in battle. Now, interesting world events here. Egypt is on the arise. They have been suppressed for a long time. They're beginning to rebuild. They have a king, not a pharaoh now. And Necho is king, not pharaoh. And that tells you something about the politics in Egypt at the time. They are changing. And Necho has made an alliance with Assyria to be their ally. Necho wants to become the next major empire. He sees the Assyrian Empire is crumbling. The generation or two before, it had reached the high water mark. It came and it captured Israel, the northern kingdom, but couldn't defeat the southern kingdom, Judah, and has never come back since then. Nominally, Judah was a vassal of Assyria because of Josiah's father, made an alliance with them. On the other hand, the Babylonians had thrown off the Assyrian Empire, and they were on the rise. Their politics had changed, and they had quit being a republic and had become a dictatorship under Nabopolassar. Nabopolassar had been elected to his position as king of Babylon. He kept the Senate, the Congress, as a consulting body, and he did not do away with it. He used it more like we would use a cabinet, but he also would ask it questions and let it debate, and if there was time to select something, let them select it and let them make decisions. And he retained all power to himself, but he used them to help establish his rule. And this made his rule very popular. The Assyrians had actually conquered Babylon because the Senate couldn't decide on whether to pay the army, to conscript an army, to appoint a leader for the army, and in their disorganized state got conquered. And Nabopolassar rose up as a strong man and said, I will have an army. We will defend ourselves. We will throw off the Assyrians. And the Assyrians had taken most of the Senate captive or killed them and taken them to Assyria and done all the atrocities they do to leaders. They didn't quite understand that grabbing the elected leaders of the Senate, the Senate basically, and they took them all captive or killed them, really didn't change the institution. They would be replaced. And, they didn't understand. Well, Nebuchadnezzar came up and says, we still need a Senate, but we need somebody to defend the country. And we need to have a stable tax system to keep a standing army so when the Assyrians show up again, we don't get defeated. And people elected him. And he immediately started raising an army and training it and having it sent back out. And he succeeded in throwing off the Assyrians. He also had the idea that part of what made Babylonians better than the Assyrians is they let the people worship whatever god they wanted to worship. And the Babylonians were so democratic before this that even their gods met in their version of heaven and elected. And, part of the Babylonian myth up till this point had been every year the gods voted, were we going to have fall this year? If it passed, fall came. Then 3 months later, they would vote, are we going to have winter this year? And if it passed, they were going to have winter. 3 months later, they would meet. Are they going to have spring? And if it passed, they had spring. 3 months later, they would meet again. Are we going to have summer? And if it passed, they would have summer. And there was times that, due to circumstances, it didn't get cold that winter, or it didn't warm up for summer, or whatever. The spring rains didn't come, or whatever. And their explanation was the gods voted against it this year. So, under that system, if you show up in town and say, I don't worship your gods, I worship this God, everybody looks at you and says, okay, there's one more God in the pantheon we didn't know about. Let him go to the Senate of the gods and cast his vote. Oh, he thinks he's the only God? Well, okay, if he can convince the other gods he's the only God, then fine, he's the only God. If he can't, we'll worship our gods and you worship your God. So the Babylonians didn't care if you had gods. Just, pay your taxes. The gods take care of God things and we take care of government things. That's the way they dealt with it. And they wanted your priest to pray for their people. And so Nebuchadnezzar threw off the Assyrians, got Babylonian independence, and then he appointed his son Nebuchadnezzar as general of the army. And Nebuchadnezzar went back to Babylon to rule Babylon and set up a government. And he did so. And he ordered his son to continue the campaign against the Assyrians. And in the first campaign against the Assyrians, Nebuchadnezzar established himself as a great general. He not only beat the Assyrians, he beat them all the way to Nineveh, their capital, captured the capital, killed the Assyrian leader, the king, the emperor, and much of his council. On the other hand, the bureaucracy and the second in command and the prime minister escaped Nineveh in its fall, and moved west and set up a new Assyrian government. And so 3 years after defeating Nineveh, Nebuchadnezzar came back and attacked that city and defeated it. And the government had a plan in place, if that happened, to evacuate that city and move west again. And where they moved to is Carchemish. So 4 years later, Nebuchadnezzar is coming, marching on Carchemish to defeat the Assyrian Empire again. In that 4 years, the Assyrians have been playing diplomacy. They've been granting autonomy to a lot of the outlying areas. As long as you pay your taxes, which they reduced, you can run your own government. Just, don't rebel. We need some soldiers. We need so much cash, etc. They did not conscript from Judah. They did conscript from the people that had been settled in Israel. On the other hand, what they did is make an alliance with Egypt, with Necho, king of Egypt, and said, "Would you come to our aid if Babylon attacks us?" And lo and behold, 4 years later, they did. So Necho is on a rush to get to Carchemish before the Babylonians, so he can help his allies, the Assyrians. He means to rise in power, and part of that deal he had with the Assyrians is Judah and the Philistines became his vassal states, and the Assyrians did not try to administer them, did not try to tax them. Necho did not tax Judah, as far as we know. Now, the Philistines and the Egyptians had been mortal enemies for millennia at this point. So they had no problem trying to tax the Philistines, draft an army from them to prevent them from having one, march them off to war to use as cannon fodder, so to speak. And, and that's what Necho has done. What he should have done, because I don't think Josiah really recognized Necho as his, that he was vessel to Necho. What Necho should have done is go, "Josiah, please let me march my army through your land. I'm going to fight at Carchemish for the Assyrians, and I need free passage, and can we work out a treaty?" Necho thought he was marching through his own land. Josiah thought he was marching through Josiah's land, because if he's not under the Assyrians, which his father had been, then he's a free man, and he's king of Judah. And so he thinks Yahweh has freed him from the Assyrians, and here the Egyptians march their army through his land. He takes offense at this, as well he should if he was an independent king. Necho, if he had gone to the bother of trying to do diplomacy, particularly if he'd gone, "Hey, Josiah, I know you got a really good army and all, but, come help me, or at least let me march through. I'll give you some payment, and we can be best friends and we can negotiate this out. Instead, what he does is march across, and when Josiah takes exception to this and raises the army and attacks him, he sends the message that we get to in verse 21. But Necho sent messengers to him, saying, "What quarrel is there between you and me, O king of Judah? It is not you I am attacking at this time, but the house of which I am at war. God has told me to hurry, so stop opposing God who is with me, or he will destroy you." Now, the word that is used here is not Yahweh. Necho is not calling Judah's God Yahweh. He is calling him Elohim. So from an Egyptian standpoint, Elohim is the plural form of El. El means God. And so Necho is saying the gods have sent me to, fight with the Assyrians and fight against the Babylonians. Don't oppose what the gods are doing, or he will destroy you. Which is a kind of an odd construct in any language, referring to plural gods in the singular he. He probably knows and understands that Josiah is a monotheist and believes in one God, and that he has one God. And so he's saying gods, but he also knows that in Judah, Elohim is used very often in the singular, because the Shema that Moses gave the people said Elohim is one. The gods are one. And they have, as they've developed that theology, realized that if Yahweh is the only God and all gods are representatives of him, are spiritual beings that have to obey him, and that he's the high God, he's the only God, and that all other spiritual beings, therefore, have authority under him. We would call them angels today. That theology hadn't developed yet in Judah or Israel. They understood them to be spiritual beings. Sometime in parts of the Old Testament, those are called the sons of God, or, to designate that they're spiritual beings, but they're not the high God. They're not the one God. So they're not a true God. It's only after Judah confronts polytheism in Babylon are they going to conclude that angels are real and they, are what the gods are, the false gods. They're also going to develop a theology of demonology where fallen angels are the demons and those are the false gods. An angel that had continued to obey Yahweh, be faithful to Yahweh, would not call himself a god, would not deceive man, and would represent himself truly. Anyway, Necho is trying to play with the language and use a word that he hopes will carry spiritual force with Josiah, and Josiah will back off. History shows that the Battle of Carchemish was very close. Nebuchadnezzar wins it. Apparently, nothing is left of the Assyrian government or of the Assyrian bureaucracy. He manages to achieve the goal of wiping the government out. The king of Assyria is never heard from again after the Battle of Carchemish. The Assyrians had a plan that after they beat the Babylonians, they were going to conquer into Egypt. They were going to conquer up around the North Sea into Europe. They were going to conquer across North Africa. They knew where the Atlantic was. Now, on Africa, they did not know much past the Straits of Gibraltar, but in Europe, they understood the shape of the Iberian Peninsula and that there was an island off to the west of Europe that we would call Britain. They understood that. And they had the plan to conquer Europe. And of course, the Assyrians, when they beat somebody, it's our gods beat your gods, and our gods are the true gods, and they're all powerful, and that's why we won. And so, therefore, you have to worship our gods because your gods are false gods, or weak gods, at least. And if you continue to worship your gods, then you have to worship our gods also. But we're not going to worship your gods because your gods got beat by our gods. They were going to spread Aramaic, the language they spoke, throughout the world. They were going to make the world Assyrian. They were going to go into India. They were going to go into the north, what's now Ukraine, and Europe. They planned to conquer all the way to the Atlantic, both in Africa and Europe. They knew about Britain. They planned to conquer it. That's the kind of vision they had. The Babylonians, on the other hand, they wanted a Babylonian empire. This would become the Neo-Babylonian Empire under Nebuchadnezzar. Nebuchadnezzar had that vision, but he also was getting to be an old man. He'd united the Babylonians and was treating them well. They were a people of traders, businessmen, and they generated wealth by that. And he could convince businessmen that paying a tax to keep a standing army to keep the Assyrians out and anybody else that was going to disrupt trade was a cheap price compared with what the Assyrians had done when they conquered. And business people believed him. It had gone poorly under the Assyrians. They'd been taxed very heavily and made destitute, and here Nebuchadnezzar is making them wealthy and wanting to defend them and keep all armies out of Babylon. And so they happily pay the lower tax to Nebuchadnezzar and willingly send sons off to join the army. Nebuchadnezzar has been winning battles, and he has been defeating the Assyrians, driving them further and further back, and getting vassal countries, and putting them under kinder terms than they had under the Assyrians. They had more autonomy, they paid less tax, but the requirement that Nebuchadnezzar, under his dad's command, imposed on them was, you must pray for the king and his sons, and we will pay part of the price of your priest and their temple and their upkeep, as long as the priest will pray for the king and his sons, and we will help support any religion you have. You have freedom of religion. You just have to support the government. And these people that had been freed from Assyrian rule thought this was novel and thought this was very beneficial. And by the way, one of the first two groups, the two first groups the Babylonian freed and made their vassal states were the Persians and the Medes. Now, the Medes had 3 generations before had Israelites settled among them and interbred with them. The Persians are an enduring people. They have made any people that conquers them Persian, and have done so repeatedly for, at this point, about 5,000 years. And they were in the process of turning the Assyrian government into a Persian government. The bureaucracy of the Assyrian Empire was copied after the Persian bureaucracy. The Babylonian Empire copied it directly. Aramaic was the language of the Persians at the time, and the Babylonians had adopted it. So the Persians thought a natural ally was the Babylonians. And when they heard the plan the Babylonians had, they were all in, and their allies, the Medes, were all in. And so Nebuchadnezzar had a large Babylonian army, a small Persian army, and a smaller Mede army under his command. And they had conquered Nineveh. They had conquered the second capital. And now they were attacking Carchemish. And they were willing for people to speak their language, worship their gods, and not pay ruinous taxes. And the Babylonians meant for them to be economically well off and prosper businesses, because they figured a low tax rate on a large business got them more money than a high tax rate that ruined business. They were business people. They understood that. So they were fixing to, on all their conquered lands, give them a lot more freedom and economic prosperity, and the world was going to be great again. And the Babylonians basically wanted to rule from the Mediterranean into India. And they wanted to rule down to Egypt. And if Nebuchadnezzar had not died on the same day that Nebuchadnezzar had conquered Carchemish, he probably would have continued being general of the army and continuing to capture Assyrian lands. That had been the plan. But Nebuchadnezzar died a natural death. and Nebuchadnezzar had to run back home and accept the kingship. He did have a younger brother that wanted the throne, had his eyes on it, but he was not a military man, and he was a tyrant. Nebuchadnezzar had to run home. The thing was, the victors write the story, and Nebuchadnezzar wrote the story. He defeated the Assyrians, wiped them out completely, defeated the Egyptians, and sent them home with a small little ragtag band. The best archaeologists can tell, the battle at Carchemish, while Nebuchadnezzar won a decisive victory against the Assyrians by totally destroying their government, he had about 5,000 people left in his army. The Egyptians had about 4,000 left. If the Egyptians had gone with their full army, they probably would have won, and the Egyptians would have been the ones building an aspiring empire. And the Egyptians wanted to spread Egyptian to the world and the worship of the Egyptian gods. Now, they didn't really want to go much north of what's now Turkey. That was a long way away. They wanted to go down into Africa. And they had just conquered the Ethiopians. And that's what they called they called it Upper Egypt, and Lower Egypt was what we call Egypt, and united Egypt together. And at one point in time, they were one people's time in history. They had become two peoples, kind of like Judah and Israel were. But, and who was dominant and controlled both of them switched from the north to the south and south to the north, back and forth. Dynasties rose and fell, and, but they had unified them. They were one country again. And so they wanted to take everything that had been Assyrian and make it theirs, conquer the Babylonians, make them theirs, and then turn south back into Africa. They knew there were some wealthy kingdoms south of Ethiopia, and they wanted to conquer them and make an empire as far south as the Assyrian Empire had been north. That was their goal. But in the whole time, they wanted to spread Egyptian culture and gods and language. And so, who won the Battle of Carchemish would decide the fate of the Near East. Was it going to be Assyrian, with Assyrian gods and Aramaic? Was it going to be Egyptian, with Egyptian gods and Egyptian? Or was it going to be Babylon, with Babylonian, which was a variation of Aramaic, and freedom of religion and local autonomy and building the economy, and the people had rights and could help change the face of the government? They could elect somebody who went to the Senate, who helped debate things and change policy and shape policy. Or would it be a top-down control of somebody who claimed, well, the Assyrians claimed they were human and not gods. but their gods helped them win, and therefore their gods were superior to all others. The Egyptians had in the past said that their king became a god when he ascended to the throne, and therefore, you had to obey the god on the throne. Well, this shaped the world because the Babylonians won and the Assyrian Empire basically vanished, and Egypt never came out of Egypt again, and Nebuchadnezzar eventually conquers Egypt and subdues it. And in the process, he lets Upper Egypt, Ethiopia, the southern part of the kingdom, become independent and becomes an ally, and spreads Babylonian culture and Babylonian concepts of inherent human rights, and Babylonian concept of bureaucracy, which came from Persia, by the way, and Aramaic into Africa. He would send people in trade outside of the boundary of the Assyrian Empire, both north and west and east and south, and make Babylon very wealthy. He wrote in his Chronicles that he came home with 1 million men. Best we can tell, he didn't even go with 1 million men. But because he won and there was no opposition at all, and Egypt never left the boundaries of Egypt again, effectively, he ruled from the Wadi of Egypt to the North Sea, to the Black Sea, and into India at the end of his campaigns. Well, at the end of Carchemish, the Battle of Carchemish. And freedom of religion and inherent human rights were established in the Middle East. And when the Babylonian Empire fell in 70 years, a little over 70 years, about 120 years, come to think of it, at this point, the Medo-Persian Empire adopted a lot of those same practices and kept them in place. Now, the Persian emperors claimed to be God, that they should be worshipped. That did go to Nebuchadnezzar's head, and God slapped him down for it. And when we study Nebuchadnezzar in Scripture, we'll get to that. It's in Daniel. But the Greeks, when they invade, they were also a democratic people. They saw the utility of the bureaucracy that the Persians had. They were spreading Greek language and culture and gods, but they also had been a democracy, and so they also adopted the concept of inherent human rights and brought that into Europe. The Romans adopted it from the Greeks, who had adopted it from the Persians, who adopted it from the Babylonians. That's the power of the Battle of Carchemish. And why did Nebuchadnezzar win? because Josiah took exception to Necho marching across his land and not asking permission. So he took his army, which may have been no larger than 10,000, but may have been as large as 250,000, and went out and attacked the Egyptians. And they did some heavy damage to the Egyptians and let the Egyptians go. And most of the army survives, and they come back home. But unfortunately, one important man dies. And basically, Necho told Josiah that would happen, but he didn't know. He was just using psychological warfare to call off this man who was impeding him, slowing him down, and endangering his army. Verse 22. Josiah, however, would not turn away from him, but disguised himself and engaged him in battle. He would not listen to what Necho had said at God's command, but went to fight him on the plain of Megiddo. Now, that's an important place. It's also known as the plain of Jezreel. The hill of Megiddo, Har Megiddo, was where Ahab had built a fortress. It's now Tel Megiddo, and a national park in Israel. A lot of excavation has been done there. We learn a lot about Israel, the northern kingdom, from that, from the time of Ahab when it was built until the fall to the Assyrians. And the plain of Megiddo had been the place of many, many major battle, lots of death on it. And one of the important things is that's where the Assyrian army was camped as they were attacking Judah when Hezekiah prayed to God and asked that God handle it. And 185,000 Assyrian soldiers died in one night, and the survivors got up and fled, left everything behind. And it took Hezekiah and all of Judah 4 days to haul off all the booty, and several months to bury all the bodies. And Megiddo is somewhere that Josiah knows well. He has toured there, teaching the people how to obey Yahweh, and torn down altars to Baal and Asherah and Milcom and all the other false gods, and tried to institute that you worship only Yahweh. And so he knew it well. And they do a really good job. The Egyptians in their history say that, they killed Josiah in battle, and that he inflicted minor damages to the army. Good archaeology says that they suffered some major losses. Judah didn't suffer that many losses, but the king did die. An archer shot at random and happened to hit him and kill him. 2 Kings chapter 23 indicates he died in battle and his body was taken back to Jerusalem. Second Chronicles indicates that he was struck and transferred to a faster chariot, not a battle chariot, and taken back to Jerusalem, and he died in Jerusalem. Har-Megiddo, by the way, when you translate it into Greek and then into Roman, you get Armageddon. Listen to the lesson where I gave a bonus lesson on Armageddon to deal with that. Verse 23. Archers shot King Josiah, and he told his officers, "Take me away, I am badly wounded." So they took him out of his chariot, put him in the other chariot he had, and brought him to Jerusalem, where he died. He was buried in the tombs of his fathers, and all Judah and Israel mourned for him. So Chronicles, which apparently is coming from the royal record, indicates he died in Jerusalem, and he was buried with honors. Second Kings say he was struck by a random arrow, and they tried to get him to Jerusalem, and he died in Lachish, and then his body was taken back to Jerusalem, and he was buried in his own tomb. Now, apparently the burial customs had been changing. The city of David had originally been the place where the royal family buried their dead, and King David had set up a tomb there and was buried there. And the kings had been buried in King David's tomb until somebody became so evil nobody wanted to honor him by putting him in David's tomb. And he had thought so much of himself. He had built a new tomb, and so he got buried there. And his son was puffed up and built another tomb for himself and got buried there. And pretty soon, everybody is building their own tomb, and the city of David becomes, instead of a living city, a cemetery for the royal house. And everybody is buried there in their own tomb. Some are buried in the ground like the people around them do. Some are buried in caves or special buildings built to look like caves that were more like the Hebrew custom, the Israeli custom. That apparently was from the time of Abraham, because Abraham buys a cave to bury his dead in. And all Israel mourns for him. He's viewed as a good king. He's ruled for 31 years. He's 39 years old. He was 8 when he started reigning. So the temple, which he had started cleaning up when he was 18th year of his reign, when he was 26, has been purified. It's been purified a while. Necho makes the mistake, and that is God's intention, so that Necho loses enough of his army he can't win. And he can't defend the Assyrians. And the Babylonians win to change the complexion of the whole Middle East and Europe. And the influence of the Babylonians changes the Greeks, changes the Romans, and we use a descendant of the Roman rule of law today. And The English, when they got a hold of that after they'd thrown off the Romans, they took it that human beings had inherent human rights, and they made the king sign a treaty with the people called the Magna Carta, which gave them inherent certain rights. And as the British Crown endured, those became codified, and it became a constitutional monarchy. And so when the colonists wanted to improve that, they, after throwing off the king, wrote Articles of Confederation. When that turned out to be too weak of a national government, they wrote the Constitution and a Bill of Rights that codified what rights human beings have that are given by God to people and not granted by the government. The government cannot infringe them. Sound familiar? Yeah, that's the United States, at least until the last presidential election. We'll see if we can maintain it. And all that comes about because the Babylonians win at Carchemish. Why did they win at Carchemish? It was apparently about 1,000 people difference in the winners and losers left. The difference is Nebuchadnezzar could run back home and become king and raise another army that same size and go march out in 3 years. The Egyptians took 40 years to get their army back to that size. And when they did, they met Nebuchadnezzar's, well, actually, it wasn't 40 years. It was less than that. Did the math wrong. It's about 25 years. And they met Nebuchadnezzar and his army at the border and lost. And Nebuchadnezzar had a huge army, and he went into Egypt and plundered it. And then goes in and defeats Tyre. Never been done before from a land army. So, Nebuchadnezzar defeats the Middle Eastern mindset and starts spreading what becomes Western values. And we are a descendant of this, in this government, of the Babylonian concept of rule today. Oh, it's changed. The founding fathers here in the United States look back to the Greek democracies and Greek republics and the Roman Republic. But those had looked back to the Babylonian democracy. So the Battle of Carchemish is vital to how the world is today. It has been called by some historians the most important battle of all time, because the Babylonians become ascendant and change the way the world thinks. And it wouldn't have happened if Josiah had not gone out and fought Necho. I also think that God wanted Josiah out of the way because the people had become corrupt and they needed to go into captivity. And Josiah might have, if he had ruled long enough, succeeded in purifying the people and getting them to worship Yahweh one more time. As it was, he made an incomplete revival. And as soon as his sons are on the throne, and 3 of his sons do rule Judah, they are evil men that worship other gods, and the people are worshiping other gods. And the prophets rightly condemn that. And they go into Babylonian captivity, where they finally focus on how do we stay faithful to Yahweh. Verse 25. Jeremiah composed laments for Josiah and said, and to this day all the men and women singers commemorate Josiah in the laments. These became a tradition in Israel and are written in the laments. The other events of Josiah's reign and his acts of devotion, according to what is written in the law of the Lord, and all the events from beginning to end are written in the book of the kings of Israel and Judah. And the people of the land took Jehoahaz, son of Josiah, and made him king in Jerusalem in place of his father. So Jeremiah writes some laments, and those apparently are psalms. They may have become the basis of what is become Lamentations, the book of Lamentations. But it's very clear Jeremiah wrote them after the defeat of Judah by Babylon, and not the first defeat, but the second defeat, when they were destroyed as country. And so Jeremiah mourns the death of Josiah, and Josiah's reform of the people is cut short because of that. And so the people become wicked again and go into captivity. But they go into captivity in a people that believed in religious freedom. And as long as you prayed for the king and his sons, they would support you worshiping your God, and they would help pay for you to worship him, as long as you prayed for the king and his sons. And so they could sit in Babylon and look at the law of Moses and look at the history of the people and come to conclusions and purify themselves and purify their culture and figure out how to prevent the culture from coming back and worshiping all the false gods it had. And they come out of the Babylonian Empire with the rabbinic system, rabbis teaching, everybody understanding the law of God. And if any of your descendants, and the custom that even if your descendants quit worshiping Yahweh, you pronounce them dead. You could still do business with them. They were just a pagan that lived in your town, but they weren't a family member anymore. And so Jews worshipped Yahweh and followed Moses' law and learned it and taught it to their children. And you got disinherited if you went and did something else. And that carried all the way through the time of Jesus. and after. By the time that Jesus showed up on the scene, they had also come to the conclusion that it was impossible for man to keep the commandments perfectly. That even if only when they were young you broke them, as an adult you kept them. But there was this problem of, how do we deal with sin? How do we get cleansed? And they had no idea. Their idea is you had to sacrifice one animal for every sin, but even they understood some sins were not numberable. Sure, if you say, murder somebody or commit adultery, you can count the number of times for those things. But how, if you're coveting, which is the 10th commandment, you're not supposed to covet. How do you count covets? You can't. It's not a numbered kind of sin. And they were in a real dilemma. And so to solve that dilemma, Jesus came on the scene and gave a once and for all perfect sacrifice that takes away the sin of the world for everybody who trusts and believes. And that comes about because the Babylonians win. They spread the concept of freedom of religion, inherent human rights across the world. The Jews come out of their captivity there purified of all pagan influences. And then they learn that even the law of Yahweh, while it's perfect, does not make you perfect. And they need a Savior. And then Jesus shows up. And that's because Josiah went into battle to oppose Necho, because Necho forgot to do diplomacy. God orchestrated it all. Holy Father, you are the author of history. You have shown yourself to people throughout history. You walked with Adam and Eve and talked with them in the cool of the evening. Apparently taught them a lot of things. Yet we still rebelled. They ate the fruit. One of their sons killed another one. And on it goes. And it became so wicked, you decided to wipe out mankind except for 8 people. Noah and his 3 sons and their 3 wives and Noah's wife. And you rebuilt humanity from there. And you spoke with your friend Abram and renamed him Abraham. And you were with Isaac. And you spoke with Jacob and changed his name to Israel and his descendants. And you spoke through prophets to them. And you raised up David and Hezekiah and Josiah and others to try to call people back. And prophets like Isaiah and Jeremiah to call people back to you. And none of that worked. So you sent your very own Son, Jesus of Nazareth, to live for us, to die for us, to forgive us of sin. We thank you for that. In your holy name, amen. I am your host, Frank Reich, Associate Pastor of Family and Ministry at Grace Fellowship Baptist Church, and this has been the Wednesday evening Bible study for Wednesday, April 1st, 2026. It was recorded on Saturday, March 28th, 2026. I had a productive day, but a frustrating day. This week has been frustrating at work, and I didn't walk as far as I meant to today. One of the first days I haven't walked far enough this year. But I got a lot of yard work done. Didn't finish anything, but I made progress. I hope to see you at church tomorrow. I hope to see you at church Wednesday night. If nothing else, we'll see you here on YouTube. Have a blessed week.